Hi, I'm James McGuire, and today we're talking about the AI Index, which is a report put out by the Stanford Institute of Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. To discuss that, I'm joined by someone who knows a lot about the report and a lot about AI, Jack Clark, Policy Director at OpenAI. Hello to you, Jack.
Hi, thanks very much for having me on. I'm excited to talk about the report.
Absolutely. The report, I think, is fascinating. Before we start, what exactly is OpenAI? I'm not sure everyone knows what that is.
So OpenAI is a research company in San Francisco that's trying to build artificial general intelligence. So,
Hmm.
you know, AI today, as we cover in the report, is having lots of impacts. Some of it works, some of it doesn't work. We're interested in the extreme long-term case where we develop much more powerful, capable technology than what we have today and
Right.
use it to transform the economy and, eventually all of human society. That's obviously quite a long way away. So, what does OpenAI actually do? We do a lot of research. We have
Mhm.
a new for-profit wing of the organization, which Microsoft invested $1 billion in recently. And there's some desire to try and look at some of the research we're doing and see if we can create sort of products that benefit humanity en route. But
Mhm.
mostly what we do is research. And the reason why we're connected to the AI index is
Right.
we think that AI is such an important issue for society that we need legislators and regulators and journalists to have better information. And
Mhm.
so the AI index is a Stanford scheme, part of the Stanford 100-year study on AI to assess and analyze AI progress and impact. And I
Mhm.
sit on the steering committee there.
Okay. All right. That's the relationship there.
Yeah.
Couple small points before we begin. I want to let everyone know who's watching and listening that you can download the report yourself. It's a Google search, something like Stanford AI Index 2019 will bring it right up. So I highly recommend downloading it. It's a fantastic read. It's so much information in there, charts and graphs. Also, for anyone who's watching and listening, please, we welcome your questions. Just click on the Q&A button down there at the bottom. Ask a question at any time. And we'll try to stump Jack. If Jack knows pretty much everything there is to know about AI, but we will stump him if we can. Uh,
I'm actually
so,
just asking my followers on Twitter to try and stump me as well.
oh, good, good. All right.
Inevitably, this is going to succeed, and I'm going to regret doing that. But let's.
So, all right, the report. I mean, it's an amazing amount of information all gathered together in one document. I have some questions, but I'm wondering, just from your view, what do you yourself find to be, the most compelling, or a couple of the most compelling points from the long, exhaustive report?
Yeah. So this report, we've done three. This is the third one. This
Mhm.
is the first one where we really tried to get good international data. Before we've
Mm.
kind of looked at it, but this time we have huge sections in the report about that. What surprised me was just how equal various international players are. Like if you look at the US and you look at China, they're much closer to peers as AI research entities than organizations with massive gaps between them. And I think that that's surprising. I think many people assume that the US had some kind of massive lead that differentiates it from everywhere else in the world. If you drill down, you discover that there's actually just a bunch of like peer nations or sets of nations with equal capabilities. And that's
Right.
surprising. It means
Right.
like it means that this is not just an academic exercise. It's not just a thing being pursued by a small number of narrow commercial interests either. It means it's being pursued by this like global plurality of organizations and groups, which means the effects are going to be weird.
Right. I mean, I saw on the list, I mean, France, Norway, I mean, it's a long, long list of countries. It's not, just a handful of countries.
Mm-hmm. And politicians have started noticing it, as we may know, because of issues of bias, because of issues of self-driving cars. There are
Right.
all of the societal changes which are making politicians realize that AI is going to be a big deal. The question is, what happens when they realize it's a big deal and want to do something about it? And I don't think anyone's quite sure of that.
We have a question from Maria Trinidad, and she asked, I saw the graphics of the report, and Latin America is almost not there. How is Chile in this aspect? We are delayed. Do you have a sense of that? Maybe it's just wasn't in there?
Well, so Juan Carlos, who's on the steering committee, he's a professor at Stanford in computer vision, and he's been doing some of the work on Latin America.
Hmm.
So when you look into that ecosystem, there's a couple of issues. One is that funding at the government level is just mostly lower across the southern hemisphere. There are obviously a few exceptions like Australia and others, but mostly it's not as high as it could be. There's
Right.
also a difference in compute. So a lot of these sort of countries which are doing well also have strategies related to sort of national data or national compute initiatives, which are a bit more mature or have involved partnerships with big cloud providers, whether that be Baidu or Alibaba in the case of Asia, or some of the Western companies in the case of North America and Europe.
Right.
Again, we just see less of that there. Now, that is changing. There are new conferences happening in Latin America now, new academic conferences, and I think that the Western institutions like Harvard and stuff are starting to go to Latin America and host conferences, because if you're in the global south, you're looking at AI and you're thinking, great, it's going to be just like globalization where it all benefits everyone else and it doesn't benefit us. So they're kind of trying to avoid that.
Yeah. Another question from Timay, they ask, are the insights from the AI index report impacting OpenAI's focus and charter? If so, how so?
Yeah, interesting. So, I mean, I have to wear two kind of hats here, where I'm on the steering committee. I also work at OpenAI. Some of what's in the report is me bringing ideas to the steering committee that we've seen at OpenAI, like there's data in there about compute growth over time, and that comes from analysis done at OpenAI, where I'd said to the steering committee, I think this is important. This has definitely like changed the way we think about things. What do you think? They generally seem to think it was interesting enough to include, so it's in there. Now, stuff which I've seen in the report that has affected us, the clearest way that things have affected me have been looking at costs. So when we think about policy and we think about what happens in AI and we think about OpenAI's place in it, there's research that becomes surprisingly cheap, surprisingly quickly to do. Whether that be training image recognition systems or speech recognition systems.
Which has come a long way in the last few years.
Yeah, there's some data in the report showing that those costs have fallen by multiple orders of magnitude in recent time. And that means that when we at OpenAI think about the impacts of AI, we need to kind of adjust those according to how cheap it is to do a certain thing. So that's an area where insights from the report are kind of changing what I say to government people, what I say internally about malicious uses and potential threats.
Right. Interesting about the competition between countries, and I see there's a part of the report that lays down by country the published papers, and it looks like the U.S. and China are top contenders in terms of published papers. Yeah. It seems like we hear about this in news. There is this key competition between U.S. and China for the AI sector. Do you think that's going to be a big competition in the years ahead? And what's your sense of the upshot of that competition? What will that mean to us?
It's a significant competition. I'm going to use this question to complain about something, because I love an complaint. I go to Washington, D.C. Once every week, or once every sort of 5 or 6 weeks. I go there a lot, and I've been doing that for 2 years because I care a lot about what the US does with regard to AI policy, because it'll affect the world. And the line I hear in Washington, D.C., which has only just recently begun to change, is the Chinese can't invent things. They just steal things. And I'm sitting there, as someone who reads these research papers, being like, no, that's very wrong. Not just that this data shows you it's wrong, it's that not all papers are alike. You could be at parity with the US on published papers, but your papers could be extremely shit, and then you couldn't really be at parity.
The numbers alone don't say that,
Yeah, what we're seeing with Chinese papers is, they're reaching to become a sort of peer on publications, but also the quality of their papers is increasing. It's a bit less quality than the overall US and European ecosystems, as analysis from Elsevier shows, but it's edging up there as well. When you look at the amounts of money being invested, both the US and China seem to be on par in terms of aggressive investments, way ahead of other countries. So there's no reason to think that they're not going to be significant. And I do think that these two countries will lead a lot of things happening in AI purely due to their scale.
Well, in terms of the money question, the report indicates that U.S. private investment leads Chinese private investment by a wide margin. So the additional Chinese investment is coming from the government?
additional Chinese investment is coming from the government. Something to caveat here, though, is that getting financial data out of China is extraordinarily difficult. And so
Right.
the data we have in the report is the data that we're incredibly confident of. There was additional data which would have nudged those Chinese investment figures a bit higher, but as we
Right.
kicked the tires on it, we couldn't be 100% confident. So sort of handle that with a slight amount of care. The US has a strong private sector ecosystem, which is actually, I know that we hear it all the time and it's very easy to get used to that, but when you look at the report, you see how unusually energetic that is, and that's
Right.
caused a lot of effects.
We have venture capitalists, for goodness sakes. Yeah.
Yeah. And now actually with, it'll be interesting to see what changes in a year when we strip out all the SoftBank money, right? Because I'm sure that showed up in a load of these investment figures in the US, and that's going to change.
Right. The SoftBank seems like it's been burned recently. The WeWork thing was not a big one for
Wasn't
SoftBank.
their best investment, no.
All right. We have another question from Andre. It looks like it's a bit of a quibble here. The AI index seems to mostly collect and present publicly available info.
Mm-hmm.
I was a bit disappointed, he says, with its content on public perception, which largely consists of Google search statistics. In the future, are there any plans to conduct original polls or otherwise dive deeper into some topics? Well, goodness.
Yeah, great. I love
we're throwing the mud at you, Jack.
This is great. This means we're having an actual conversation. So,
right.
One, Google Trend statistics, they're pretty useful. They give you a very coarse measure of popularity for something in the world. So it is handy. Along with that, we've tried to get at the public piece by measuring places where you have data generated that's quantifiable, as in the number of mentions in Congress about AI or machine learning. That's how we get again at some of that sort of public aspect. Another measure we've introduced is counting measures in central banks minutes from the UK Bank of England and others. So we've also counted mentions in earnings calls from businesses. And the reason we do that is that those are kind of symptoms of a certain type of conversation. Right. Now, to the point of more original analysis here on public perception, we'd love to do it. Every year we talk about all of these additional things to do. The issue is, I have a colleague, Bao Zhang, who's at Yale and was at the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford. She did a public opinion survey about what people in the public thought about AI companies. And she started doing that survey 2.5 years ago, and it came out a few months ago, and it's great. But we suddenly realized how difficult the original data piece is. But we have money now. So in 2020, we've got money and time. So actually, we do hope to do more original analysis. And please quibble with me further. I love ideas.
If I see you out in San Francisco, Jack, like having a coffee or a beer, I'm going to say, hey, Jack, you're supposed to be like doing original research now, aren't you?
Yeah. No, that's good. We need to do more of this. It's useful.
We have a question from Matt, but I think it fits into something we're going to get to in a little while. So let's hang on to that one question. There's a neat graphic in the report about attendance at artificial intelligence conferences, and it's an amazing like hockey stick parabolic movement upward for about like the last, say, 24 or 36 months. I mean, the graph just shoots upward in terms of conference attendees. Why now do you think it's getting so big?
Money, and yes, money actually. But I'm not being. It's the first time I went to an AI conference was I went to NeurIPS in Montreal in 2015. I was still a journalist at the time.
Gotcha.
NeurIPS then was probably, you can see on the graph, 2,000-3,000 people, something like that. And since it's gone up to somewhere above 10,000 or approaching that. At the time, 2015, Google's been running a deep learning initiative out of Google Brain for a couple of years at that point. They've already bought Jeff Hinton's company. OpenAI's just formed. I think Gary Marcus either just has sold geometric intelligence to Uber or is just about to. It was a time where you could feel that the money had arrived and it was starting to take off. And I think that the reason why it's continued is that this technology actually works in some areas. Home security cameras, perceiving weather via satellite. There are lots of economic cases where AI has begun to mean something. And so attendance is going to continue to grow. To put it in perspective, there's a really big computer vision and graphics conference, I think, called SIGGRAPH. And I think attendance at
Right.
SIGGRAPH peaked at 30,000 people at one point in time. So we're not the worst yet. We've got a ways to go, but
Right.
we're definitely, think about computer graphics. Computer graphics is just part of the economy. And I
Right.
think that what this sort of generally tells us is AI is becoming integrated into the economy, and we can see attendance at these conferences as a proxy for that.
I think there's a sense among businesses that we need to get on board the AI train because we're not going to remain competitive if we're not harnessing AI. So we're confused about how to do it, but we need to do it. So let's start pouring money into it, and we need to get on board.
Yeah, I mean, it's you've been around for a long time, so you remember big data and cloud computing. It's exactly
Right.
the same thing, where people are like, "What's our cloud strategy? We need cloud." Or
Right.
what's our data strategy? We need a lot of data, and we'll stick it in like Hadoop and not do anything with
Right. Right. Remember Hadoop? Yeah.
it.
Well, actually, I think that AI is probably bigger than cloud and big data. I mean, I know everyone has its hype curve, and it's
Yeah.
but AI to me feels even more foundational than cloud and data ever were.
Well,
Personal
actually,
opinion.
in the report, I think we measure Google search interest for cloud, big data, and all of this stuff. And we do this in conference call details. And what we see is that businesses are mentioning this more than cloud computing and big data. And that can seem like, oh, yeah, well, that's just sort of bullshit signaling on the part of businesses. But
Right.
actually, as you remember, when the companies were telling us they were investing in big data or they were investing in cloud, they were standing up like huge teams of people to actually do stuff. And even if it didn't lead to exactly the benefits they thought they'd get, it
Right.
changed a lot of these companies, and it also changed the technology infrastructure we work with today. And so I
Totally.
think if this happens with AI, yeah, a lot of money is going to get wasted, but some of it's going to do really wild things.
Question from Russell Douglas. What was the name of that other report? The one that took 2.5 years to do?
Yeah, give me a second and I'll just bring it up.
Yeah,
So
let's check that out. It seems like it's. I mean, if
it's
she
a
worked
great
on it for
report.
2.5 years. That's a cool report.
Yeah, so the person who did it is she's called Baobao Zhang, Baobao Zhang, Zhang.
Hmm.
Um, and the report is, where is it? Oh, yes. Artificial Intelligence, American Attitudes and Trends. And that's Baobao Zhang and Alan Defoe. I strongly recommend reading that report. It's got great data in it.
Okay,
It
excellent.
includes also things like which of these tech companies would you trust to develop powerful AI?
Oh,
Google, Microsoft, Facebook.
right,
Facebook doesn't do so well in those public opinion surveys. It's got
right.
a lot of interesting stuff there, which tells us broader things about how the public feels about tech. And I guess it's being dramatized by them saying, how would you feel about tech with powerful AI? And then you get
Right, right. I imagine in that particular list, Google would be the winner. I don't know if it's a trust factor, but in terms of like a leader in developing it, and it feels like in the cloud race, Google's strength in AI is going to be its little trump card, perhaps to catch up. I don't know. It's slightly off topic, but I think it plays a factor.
Well, I think there's something to it. And also, we've kicked the tires on all of the clouds. We've used Google. It's pretty good. A couple of areas where it does really well are stuff like Kubernetes integration, because they develop Kubernetes and other things.
Right.
I won't bore the entire webcast with the minutiae there.
But what's more exciting than Kubernetes?
I know, it's
Um, Getting back to the report, a couple of really interesting things about the technology. I'll quote. I think it's about machine training a machine learning system. I believe it says, "quote In a year and a half, the time required to train a network on cloud infrastructure has fallen from about 3 hours in October 2017 to about 88 seconds in July 2019." Wow. And then, quote, "the amount of computation used in the largest AI training runs has doubled every 3.4 months since 2012.
yeah.
In other words, it's been doubling every 3 months or so for 7 years. It's a net increase of about 300,000, for God's sakes. So I don't know if there's a question there, but I guess I have to sit back and go, I'm stunned by the level of increase in the technology. It's just really racing ahead at this point.
It's it's weird. This is all extremely weird. I say this in my presentations, like
Right,
doubling rate of 3.4 months on computation. Bloody strange. Like
right,
what, like 18 to 24 months has changed all of civilization.
right.
So the implications of this are huge. Now let me address the seeming different data here, because it is worth talking about. On
Okay.
one hand, stuff's getting cheaper, but
Right.
stuff at the frontier isn't getting cheaper. It's more that certain well understood capabilities, like trading on 1 million pieces of data to a certain classification accuracy for a certain object label in an image, that
Right.
stuff gets cheap over time because of computational improvements. So you save on the cloud money.
Okay.
Uh, and algorithmic improvements which save on training efficiency. Now, in a year and a half, we haven't made such progress in cloud economics that you can have the time and cost fall so dramatically. So what's
Right.
actually happened is we're seeing the integration of new research insights into a well understood economically useful task like image recognition to bring that time down. So that's
Gotcha.
amazing. And that to me that's not like frontier research. That is the integration of existing research into a sort of economically meaningful AI task. And then on the other side, you have these growing computational expenditures. Now, those are more like you're trying to run experiments at the largest possible scale to understand how these things behave at that scale, because you know that in a few years, that scale will be really cheap. You know, in the same way that this thing costs less over time to run on a cloud or had its sort of time to train improve, that's going to happen with the big stuff. And so you kind of want to train the largest possible systems you can now, because you're going to have the best possible intuition about the longest part of the future then.
Right. Right.
Another thing to remember is that this stuff's like write once, run anywhere. Like if I train a model for Google Translate on, 108 languages or something,
Right.
then now that I've got it, I can use that model in hundreds of locations. So though I've had this big eye-popping compute and energy expenditure to train a model, I'm then going to like plug this in like a bit of Lego to hundreds of different systems. So the economics of this stuff work out really differently once you start deploying it as well.
Have model will travel in essence.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good way of
Yeah.
it.
Interesting too. And then Matt Taylor has a couple of questions about the technology since we're on it. Question one, do you see any exciting hardware developments that could level the playing field for smaller AI research companies? And there have been big neuroscience discoveries since deep learning has become relevant in the market. Can we apply what we've recently learned about brains and neurons to today's AI? That's a big, those are two big questions, certainly the second one.
All right.
General thoughts on that?
I'll do the second one first. So
Okay.
can we apply neuroscience stuff to today's AI? People are trying, and we should be able to, in the sense that I don't think this is like magic. I think that this is something that we can characterize and write code about eventually. I've talked to people like Jeff Hinton about this. Jeff Hinton notes that neurons spike. So when you have neurons firing in your head, you're not going 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1. You're going 0, riding up sort of an amplitude to a signal which does something. How do you inject spiking into neural networks is the sort of thing that Jeff's been thinking about for a while. He's written some papers, and I think that there's lots of papers which show that in certain toy environments this might work better, but we're yet to really scale this up as large as we can. Similarly, DeepMind did some work where they actually replaced a convnet with a convolutional network structured according to something that they knew about the fovea, how your eye actually has denser cones in the center for processing information and sparser cones on the exterior. They kind of used this structure in their thing, and it measurably improved performance in vision-related tasks. So to answer the second question, I think there's lots there. I think there's also lots of signs that this works, but integrating it's really difficult, and you need these interdisciplinary people and people who, frankly, like Jeff Hinton, are grumpy enough that they will not listen to people say, no, this won't work. They'll just keep doing it for a decade until it works.
Jeff Hinton is grumpy. I did not know that. Okay.
He's a cheerful, grumpy Englishman,
It's the best kind.
You get on.
The other part of the question?
Yeah, can you just refresh my memory?
Sure. It's can you see any exciting hardware developments that could level the playing field for smaller AI research companies?
Yeah, we've explored other types of hardware, like any big AI company, where one of the people that the vendors come to be like, look at this, tell us how it works, tell us what's good. I think I'm under like multiple NDAs here, so give me a second as I work out what I can easily say.
Right.
what we've observed is the usability of GPUs is really, really hard to beat. So you might have hardware that has better specific performance traits. If you're maybe a big business or actually a startup running a very specific use case, the economics might work out that using different hardware saves on your costs. But because we're a research lab, we kind of want to do everything. So for us, that almost biases us mostly towards like commodity infrastructure like GPUs because it's got the greatest level of flexibility. And I think that this trade-off is going to be difficult. Additionally, for startups, I think that the costs of compute are quite high, and it's hard for me to see how, unless the economics there really, really changes fundamentally, I think that it's actually a surprisingly hard market for startups, and you're sort of hearing this from lots of entrepreneurs.
Gotcha. Okay, it makes perfect sense. The issue of AI jobs, I think AI and jobs and how artificial intelligence will affect the job market is a hot debate. I mean, there's sort of the optimists who go, hey, AI is going to create more jobs. It's going to be this golden age of jobs. Then there's some pessimists who go, well, there's going to be a lot of people displaced by AI. You know, autonomous driving is going to put those drivers out of work. There's a fast food chain that bought 500 kiosks, and the users are now going to buy from the kiosk, and say, at the grocery stores, we see the self-checkout. Not exactly AI, it's more automation. But how do you come down on that great debate? And the report seemed to say, let's not be alarmist about the job apocalypse. But do you personally agree or disagree, Jack?
I think that AI leads to massive technological change. I think if you look at history, technological change usually leads to one of revolution, war, or economic collapse. And so I think that the effects of AI are going to be extremely profound. And I think the effect on the workforce could be like extremely messy.
Yes.
I think what we need to do, and what inspires me to work on this is I have an almost naive belief that if we get better data in front of policymakers and call for the creation of original data on things like AI and employment, we can probably deal with this disruption better. Right now, we're kind of blind. The reason why there isn't more data in the index itself is that getting this data is very hard. It requires you to do like decent censuses at the level of individual industries in your country. The US is starting to do stuff here, but we don't have the ability to generate the data that would let us easily say if there was a problem or not. And that's a big problem because for us, like, what I want is I want to have a big spreadsheet that tells me the future of the world, right? About AI and employment.
I want that same spreadsheet.
Everyone wants this, but I'd like to get close because if I get close, I can say to a policymaker, you need to do something. And the fact that I can't have that ability today, even though you have the same intuition as I, that it's going to have a big effect, is
right. It really is. And I think that the core problem there is that there are going to be a lot of great jobs in artificial intelligence, but the problem is those jobs are going to require training, education, a college degree.
Yeah.
And so some of the workers who don't have access or don't have that kind of training and education are going to be out of luck.
Well, I've talked about this in a couple of venues before. AI gives us a choice to actually change the quality of other jobs. I'll give you an example. Nursing and elder care. In the US, in Japan, in China, in every really like large sort of economy, they've got a demographic problem, which is a shitload of old people, not enough young people. It's gonna mess up the economy massively. One thing it is gonna do is create unbelievable demand for young people to like care for elder people.
Yes.
And today in the US, my mother was a nurse and did some of this in the UK, but today in the US, that's a low quality job for many people. Being an elder carer, very, very poor job. AI probably gives us the ability to choose as an economy if we can make jobs like that much better. Because there are going to be some jobs that are going to grow in the AI economy, which will involve lots of skills like programming AI systems. But there will also be other classes of job that we know are going to grow whatever happens. Because like my granddad isn't going to have a robot pat him down at night. He would much rather a person do that. I think most old people would prefer this.
Right.
So I'm kind of saying to policymakers, let's accept that there's a change, and then let's like point at certain job classes which are going to massively grow and which we can actually train people into and make them good. That is a choice we have.
That's a ray of optimism. I'm going to hang on to that ray of optimism amid my overall pessimism on that topic.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you for that.
you're welcome.
The idea of AI and ethics. I mean, the report states, and I'll quote here: research around ethical AI, especially on fairness, accountability, and transparency of machine learning models, has grown.
Hmm.
But to me, it feels like the technology is way ahead of sort of the ethical policing, and that, there's the idea of explainability where a bank or whoever who uses an algorithm to decide loans, and they've got to explain, why did you turn these people down? Why did your algorithm turn these people down? And so, I mean, can that algorithm really be explained to the general public? And there's no governing body there in terms of ethics and AI. I mean, it seems like the technology is far outstripping any ethical concerns. Thoughts,
Yeah.
Jack?
Well, it's a little like I'm trying to think of something which walks the tightrope between being extreme and being not too scaremongery or hypey. So let me come up with the right example.
Okay, good.
Um, all right, I've got a good example. In 2015, a Canadian startup announced via a press release that it had successfully synthesized horsepox, and it announced this because it wanted to advertise some decent, sort of sophisticated chemical analysis and creation capabilities it had.
Uh-huh.
Now, the problem here is if I can make horsepox, I can also make smallpox in the same quantity, which is a
Right.
bad thing. Governments have actually invested quite a lot of money in protecting the world from smallpox. We're all happy about this. And it
Right.
led to governments having a chat with that startup.
Mm-hmm. I
We're in
bet.
that position with AI today. I think most AI developers are going to try and do things for good reasons, and then are going to announce like, oh, we've just released a system that can make any DJI drone navigate to a specific face that you give it, and we've done that for sports. Except obviously that's not going to just get used for sports, it's going to get used for all kinds of things.
Right.
What we need to do is we need to create culpability among developers. Earlier this year, OpenAI had a big text generation system called GPT-2. We made ourselves culpable for it by saying at the start, we think this could have weird policy effects. We slowly released it through the year while publishing research on disinformation, on detection, on threats of GPT-2.
Right.
And we did that because we wanted to show that as an AI developer, we can also try and think about this stuff. Now, thinking is insufficient for the scale of the challenge AI poses to society, but you need to start somewhere. And I think where we need to start today is the AI community needs to have like real zero bullshit conversations about the impact of what it's doing. And if we have more of that, that might lead to ethics that becomes more restrictive in a beneficial way. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I do. It seems like there would need to be a governing body at some point. I don't know where or how that governing body would be
Oh,
created.
look, I mean, it's not there are governing bodies that mean that certain types of research on high energy physics or nuclear material doesn't get published on the internet.
Okay.
But it's not mostly the governing bodies that stop it, because you can't, like, one group of people can't stop all of those research papers being published. That's actually just a consequence of the physics community and other academic communities drilling this into their students for like decades and being like, there's some types of research that we just handle differently.
Right.
And I think that what we're going to get to is something like that. The problem, as with most things in AI, is this is happening on a massively accelerated timescale relative to traditional technologies.
Right.
So there's kind of an assumption that it'll work out, but maybe it happens so quickly we need other tools as well.
Mm. Well,
Or
time
my
will tell. And
yeah.
go ahead, please.
No, I'm just saying how cheerful that sounds, but you know.
Right.
So part of the role of things like the AI index is helping to give us some of that data, so we can just sort of objectively state, okay, are things happening so quickly we need to do stuff differently? Or are
Right.
things happening at about the pace we'd expect, and therefore we can do traditional problem solving here?
Right. It's a lot of good stuff. I urge people to download the report. But Jack, did you have any closing thoughts? Anything you wanted to add before we say goodbye?
Yeah, just a couple of closing thoughts. I think,
Yeah.
and I've got a couple of questions on Twitter that maybe I should go through as well.
Oh, okay. If you do, please let's address them.
Okay, let's address the questions first. So,
Good.
a question from Harsh Singhal on Twitter is, what problems do you recommend motivated people tackle with access to cloud AI services, data sets, and massive models? I think this is a great question.
It's a
I
big
think
question.
people should go and look at translation, specifically how well can we take released language models like BERT or whatever and fine-tune them on target languages to create language models that work on languages where there's less data. That's just a problem today that needs to be worked on, and there's lots of countries like Estonia which want their language to be sort of machine readable and want to support work here. So try and do that.
Right.
Another couple of questions. One is from Carson Kahn. Why shouldn't the report be called the Machine Learning Index? This is a good cheeky question.
Okay.
I think the answer is just the purpose of the report is also to be read by policymakers. AI is the word in policymakers' heads, and it increases the likelihood that it gets on the table that it needs to be on. So that's the question.
And it feels like, I mean, there's so much confusion about the terms. To me, I see machine learning as a subset of the overall AI umbrella, but the terms get used many different ways.
Yeah, and some of this is the report, not so much this year, but in the past we've included data on AI technologies for used in things like SAT solving. Now that has only recently started to get a lot of work done on it by the sort of deep learning community, and actually had a lot of methods which are non-machine learning based in it before. So there's also a bit of a reason to call it AI because it's at times broader than just ML.
Okay. Yeah.
Cool. I think we've done the questions. I just wanted to make sure we got to those, you know.
It was fantastic. I totally learned a lot, Jack. Thank you very much. And I'll send you the link and we can tweet it. Thank you very much.
Have a great day. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.